record. Okay, welcome everybody to the Q&A thread for this month. So I'm going to take just a couple minutes to do some housekeeping things because I've shared a couple different, we've been tweaking the process in SLP Learning Academy so that I can figure out what best works for all of the members, because some people like to pop in and ask questions live. Some people like to watch the recordings afterwards on their own time. It seems like the latter is what people prefer, because I know that during the day, you've got a lot of therapy sessions. During the evening, that gets crazy as well. So people like to ask questions on their own time. So what I have been doing the last couple of months for these Q&As, instead of having a live call, is or instead of doing the traditional Zoom call like we've been doing in the past, I have been taking everybody's questions, like letting everybody, share whatever their questions are with me. And then monthly I go live and I answer those questions. And what I've been doing the past couple months is just making this thread available in here as well in this group, so that if you have questions that come up throughout the month, this is going to be where you're going to ask them. So what I'm going to do today, the last couple months, what I did was I just posted the thread and let everybody come in and answer their questions or ask their questions. But what I wanted to do today was actually present some information like I used to do on the calls, just because I've had a lot of questions come up recently about some certain topics. So I am going to do just a little short Q&A today based on some questions that have come in. But if anybody else has questions throughout this time, if you're in the SLP Learning Academy group, just post them in the comment section below, and I'm happy to answer them live. But also, if you are watching this recording after the fact, so if it is beyond, the 2 to 3 o'clock time on Monday Central Time, and you are watching this and you have a question, post it in the comments below and I will get to it. I'll be checking on this thread every, a couple times a week this month. So you can ask a question, whether it be a clinical question, whether it be about consulting or advocacy, you can ask your questions in this thread below. So for now, I wanted to just go ahead and address some of the questions that have come up. Sorry, I've got two screens here. I've got a monitor to make sure I can follow everybody's questions. I'm going to share my screen and share some resources in just a couple minutes, because I wanted to talk about some questions that have been coming up regarding eligibility. So specifically, I'm going to talk about eligibility in the school systems. And the reason that I'm going to address this is because I know that we've got some people who are in private practice, for example. We've got a lot of SLPs who are in the school systems. And I wanted to talk about the eligibility for school, because there's a lot of times, as you might know, some differences in what would make a student eligible for services in the school systems, meaning that they qualify for a special education service, versus someone who might be able to get therapy from a private therapist. So obviously we know that there are different guidelines there. And I bring this topic up a lot because when I was in the schools, this was one of those key areas where I did feel like I had to put my foot down and advocate for myself a lot and have some clear guidelines around that. And the thing is that your administrators, luckily when I was in the schools, especially at the elementary level, one of the building principals was really fantastic about advocating for us. If we had a parent, for example, who wanted services for their child and we were not able to provide them because they didn't meet the guidelines in the school systems, then she was really good at helping us and kind of having our back that way. And that is not always the case. That it's not always going to be the case when you're in the school systems, because of a number of reasons, mainly because a building principal is not going to know developmental milestones like you are as the SLP. So we do have to provide that level of education, but it's also about building that relationship. Part of the reason why my administrator would always be very helpful in those situations was because over time I had shown her that I was very knowledgeable about that information. So she knew if I was saying this student isn't appropriate for services, she could trust my judgment. So that was really important. So you do have to have some of those conversations repeatedly where you're showing how you make decisions. You're educating and you're providing that information. And that is what's going to really help to allow you to be able to set some boundaries there. So obviously we've got that relationship with the building principal, and then we have the relationships with the teachers. And so those are two separate things. They're both super important. And I will get to both of those things. So what I wanted to talk about first was developmental milestones and eligibility for students with when it comes to articulation. And then I'm going to talk about language and give you some tools and resources there. So for articulation, there was kind of a big to-do in the last couple of years because there was an article that came out that summarized some of the developmental norms when it comes to articulation. And it sort of freaked everybody out, especially the people in the school systems. And it's not really new research. It was just summarized and kind of presented in a new way. I'm going to share some links to actually an article from the Informed SLP where she outlined, Meredith from the Informed SLP outlined what that research means and give some helpful links in her article that's freely available on the Informed SLP blog. But then I'm also going to share another article with research that it not only considers those developmental norms, but it explains what those developmental milestones and those developmental norms mean as far as application in the school systems and why it's different from private practice. And these two things I'm sharing with you are really important because they're freely available to you and because they're kind of a good synopsis that you can share over and over again to your administrators, to other SLPs, to teachers, to explain why the eligibility is a little bit different for school SLPs versus SLPs in private practice. And they also could be helpful in sharing this information with parents. I remember that this particular information was shared with me kind of as it was brought into a meeting as ammunition to try to fight against what I was saying. There was a situation where there was a boy in kindergarten who did not have his R yet, and he was getting therapy from an outside therapist. And I just said, we'll continue to screen him and monitor him and, monitor his progress, but we can't provide therapy right now in the school systems. And the mother got very upset, and the school therapist kind of, instead of, contacting me and talking to me, basically gave her all of this stuff. And, it was not a good meeting. It was not a good set of meetings, but basically the therapist said, well, because the 90% of kids have the R sound by age 5, you should be providing him services because he doesn't have the R yet. And so that was kind of used as an argument against what I was recommending. And luckily my principal did have my back. It was kind of overkill because we did end up having to get the special ed director involved for an R in kindergarten. And it was this huge meeting. You would think it was a student that needed very extensive services, but it wasn't. So I would have really liked to be able to have one of these conversations and have access to some of these resources that I'm going to share with you today before I dealt with that particular situation, because it would have been very helpful in sharing this information preemptively and having a conversation with the parent before it escalated to the point that it did. So basically, two things. There is, again, what the research says is that when we think about developmental norms, about 90% of kids will have the majority of their speech sounds by age 5. So that's 90% of kids will be able to say, even the hard sounds like R's and S's, they will be able to say those sounds by the time they are 5. So that means that if you had a child, in theory, the way that some people have interpreted that is that if you have a child who has a minor R, doesn't have their R yet in kindergarten, for example, or maybe doesn't have their S yet in kindergarten, or one of the other sounds that is a common one that comes up, that if they don't have it yet by that age, that they should be on your caseload. That's how some people interpret that, meaning that because this is the age that 90% of kids have this, that means that that's the mark for eligibility. That is not the correct way to interpret that, because what about that other 10%? We don't necessarily know. This research is accurate. A lot of kids do have all of their sounds by kindergarten, by first grade, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a child who doesn't have those sounds within that age range is eligible for special education services. Because when we actually look at what the guidelines are, there has to be an adverse impact on their education. There has to be an adverse impact socially. And so basically, that is what the articles that I'm going to share with you explain. It explains how it's different in the schools. And one of the links that I'm going to share with you does kind of go through not just developmental norms, but it also goes through what the eligibility guidelines are and how they should be interpreted. So basically, just because you don't have what 90% of kids are able to do by a certain age, doesn't mean that you have a disability that warrants special education services. Now, if you have multiple sound errors and it's impacting your ability to communicate to the extent that it's hard for you to participate in class, there's a link between that and phonological awareness that's impacting your vocabulary development, and that is impacting your ability to learn. That's a different story. What we're talking about is more those mild sound errors that don't seem to be impacting socially and aren't impacting educationally as well. So I'm going to share those two things just because that's something that kind of freaked everybody out a while ago. And honestly, I always would, if I had enough time to see those kids, or at least to screen them and provide some resources for the parent or the teacher, I always would do that. So even if I wasn't officially qualifying students for special ed, if I had the time, which I usually made the time, I would provide some parent training for those families, or I would just provide some information such as what I'm going to share with you today. And a lot of times the information was how to elicit the sounds, how to facilitate the sounds, a good way to model and things like that, what they should expect. I would provide all of that information to the parents, and I would say, let's check in again in another year or so. So it's not that I would just forget those kids if they were beyond that age when we would expect those norms, but I wouldn't necessarily qualify them for special education and put them on, an IEP or something like that. Now, for certain cases, I might do some kind of a short-term intervention plan. Maybe they would, if the parents were okay with it, if it didn't seem to be impacting them, to come out of class whenever they could, and if I had the bandwidth for it, I would take some response to intervention cases. But the only reason that I would do something like that is, again, preventative thinking. Okay, could this potentially have an adverse impact? Could this potentially be something that could impact their communication and their ability to socialize further down the line? I'd always think about those types of things. And I always made it very clear that this isn't, this is only going to be something that's going to warrant continuous services if we know for sure that it's going to be a problem long term. Otherwise, I would just stick to kind of those short-term interventions, whether it be just providing information or whether it be doing a short-term intervention plan. And again, with the short-term intervention plan, that you've got to really weigh that gray area there and make sure that there is a potential adverse effect before you even offer that, because again, you shouldn't be pulling kids out of class when there's not an adverse impact. I don't know, it's, I guess, just kind of, you're wearing your heart on your sleeve, people are asking for help. I would always be very tempted to try to sneak some of those kids in, but you do have to be aware. And this is one of the things that's pointed out in one of the articles that I'm going to share, is that if you are pulling a student out of their classroom and that means they're not in their least restrictive environment. So qualifying them for a service that they don't need is actually a violation of the student's rights, because you are not providing the least restrictive environment. They're missing class. If you're going to emphasize one thing, that means that you have to take them away from another thing. So it's always that balance. Now, of course, if you are a private practice SLP, you can obviously use different criteria than a school SLP. And I think it's really important. When I did start to take some private clients, when I was still in the schools in one community, and then I was in a different community where I lived and was taking some clients, I made it very clear to the parents that I am going to share this information with you. Please share it with your child's teacher. Please share it with the SLP at the child's school. But that SLP at the child's school is going to be the one to determine if your child qualifies for services at school. They might not. And I would always be very clear about that and let them know that it's a little bit different as far as what I can do and what the school SLP could do. And I would always, I would always be very clear about that. I think that in the past, when I have had some conflict with private practice SLPs, it was usually the ones who weren't aware that there was a difference in eligibility guidelines from the school versus private practice. I think a lot of people know that now, but it really just depends on someone's background. A lot of times people are very confused, even people that are supposed to be the ones that are following the guidelines. There's a lot of rules and it gets confusing, and there's changes and updates to all of these mandates and things like that. So it does get very confusing. And I think that it's always good to have those open lines of communication so that when you have something like that going on, you can clarify why somebody is making the decisions that they are, and you can work together. So I always talk about school guidelines, because I do think it's important for private practice SLPs to know that for when they're working with SLPs in the schools, and then also because sometimes they can be the ones that provide that additional support if the child wants to keep working on this, but there's just really not a good time in the school day. It really doesn't make sense for them to be taken out of class in order to do it. It might be a better situation for that child to just not be in special ed, to just be in their classes all day and not get pulled out for anything. And then if they want to work on speech after school, they can do that. So a lot of times that does make more sense for the child. I know that obviously it ends up being an additional cost in many cases, but that might be in many situations the best option for kids. So I'm going to share, once I get off of this, once I'm done recording, I'm going to share links below this video of a couple articles about school eligibility and and the developmental norms that that kind of freaked everybody out a few years ago. And again, like I said, these norms have been out for a while. It's just that they've been compiled and published and kind of re-promoted and based on a number of different studies. So that's what I wanted to share about articulation. Again, the best thing that you can do is to be continually having these conversations and reminding people of these guidelines, because they're confusing. Even a teacher, even an administrator, especially a parent, they're going to forget the rules and how the process works because they're not in it all the time like we are. So it's always very important to keep explaining this over and over again. And then also it's important to share information like the information I'm gonna link you to. And if you want to take this information and even condense it a little bit more, that's great as well. Or if you just kind of, what I would like to do, or what I would often do, is I would just share a Cliff Notes version and just explain it and then give them a link or give them a printout that they could look at on their own time. Honestly, a lot of times when I would do something like that for a teacher, for a building administrator, what they would typically do is as long as they saw that I had information that I had researched, they really wanted the Cliff Notes version. They did not want to read this whole huge article. They wanted me to just summarize it and just show them that I had a place they could go for more information. A lot of times they wouldn't read that because they were busy. They want you to explain it for them. So a lot of times it's not a matter of you needing a ton of articles. You don't need to write a dissertation and present it to them. You just need a couple key pieces and a couple pieces of information to show them that you've done your research. And a lot of times people will kind of be good with that, especially if you're somebody that responds with information, with answering questions instead of, being defensive. Because I definitely got defensive a couple times, early on in my career when somebody who was not me was telling me that I should and shouldn't qualify students when they weren't necessarily the one that was qualified to be doing that. So now I wanted to switch gears and talk about language, because language is obviously a lot more gray than articulation, even though, as I've kind of discussed, even with articulation, with having norms that say at 90% of 90% of 5-year-olds have these sounds, even something like that can be misinterpreted, as I have explained. But what I wanted to do now is just share a piece of information that I have used for, it's multifunctional. So let me share my screen really quickly here. Okay, so I have this tool up on the screen. I will link to this again. This is something that is actually part of my SPOT framework guide that is in my Language Therapy Advanced Foundations course. However, I'm going to share this specific resource with you because it is multifunctional. And so I explain it in one context in that program, and I'm going to explain it in a different context here as well. So this rating scale is non-standardized, and it is just something that I have come up with to do a number of different things. Number one, I have used it for screening before because there are not always, depending on the situation, sometimes it can be hard to get a good, accurate screening for language. And so it's really good to have some solid processes that you use for non-standardized data collection. So non-standardized, again, it just means that it is not norm referenced, or there's not a specific criterion reference point where if they get more than this score, then they pass, kind of a thing. It is descriptive. I have made it so that there are some objective answers, and it does allow you to get some hard numbers. But because it's not standardized, you do have to know how to interpret the information. So I do consider it to be more of a structured resource that is, again, non-standardized. So a lot of times when people think of the word non-standardized, they think informal and non-standardized are the same thing. They're not necessarily. Informal could mean a ton of different things. Informal could be you go into a classroom and you have a conversation with the student and there's no structure, there's no rhyme or reason to the process. That could be informal. But if you're using non-standardized methods, that what I just described, so something that doesn't have any structure, that is non-standardized. But also there could be methods that are a little bit more structured, but they're just not norm referenced or criterion referenced, that are also non-standardized. And so that's where I would place this resource. And the reason that I do that is because a lot of times when you are just doing some kind of an informal observation, or you're having a conversation with someone, it can be really hard to have a consistent process that allows you to get good information if you don't at least have some game plan or structure going forward. So this doesn't necessarily pigeonhole you into needing a specific criterion score or a norm reference score that you know is going to be not necessarily accurate anyways, which is the case with some screenings. But at the same time, it does allow you to be structured so that it's not a total free-for-all when you're trying to collect informal information. So I've used this as a screening tool in that respect, where I could just go give this to a teacher and just have them fill it out. So I could see, are there major red flags based on what the teacher is saying? I could literally just give this to the student or give this to the teacher and have them fill it out. I could do this for a parent too as well, but it's a little bit more, the questions are a little more geared to an educational setting. So you could use it as a screening tool. And so it can be used in the eligibility process from that respect. And if you notice, there's not a magical number that they need in order for you to move forward with a screening. But if the teacher is giving you multiple pieces of information and is saying on this rating scale, there's multiple areas where this teacher has a concern, and then you go and talk to the teacher and there's additional academic data like they're failing reading comprehension tests, or you look at their written language samples and they're nowhere near meeting the criteria that they need, or maybe they have some other literacy benchmark and they don't perform well on that as well. So if you're using this in conjunction with those types of things, it can be very helpful in identifying the kids that do need to be evaluated. So it can be helpful in the eligibility process from that angle. And again, this can be something you just give to a teacher and it's really quick. This can also be something that you use to just have with you when you're going in to have a conversation with the teacher, just to help you ask some specific questions. And you don't necessarily have to rigidly interview them and have them fill it out. You could do it that way, but you could also just have it in front of you as you're having a conversation with them, and you just kind of make sure that you get this information and you give them an idea about some of the skills that you would be looking for. So that's one way that I use it. I also use this for progress monitoring for kids that are already on my caseload. Again, same kind of thing. When I go in and have a conversation with the teacher about how the student is doing, it's the same process that I would use for screening, except the question isn't, should we evaluate the student? The question is, okay, they're in therapy now. What's the progress? What's the status update? And this helps you to structure those conversations. So where this falls in with eligibility is that I would actually, so in addition to just using this for when a student needs to be screened, potentially, what I would do with this is that when you are, when you're working with teachers and like, let's say that you're making your rounds at the beginning of the year, or let's say that you have a plan and you want to, like, depending on how many grade levels that you cover, I would normally kind of like go month by month. I'd be like, all right, this month, I'm going to make a point to get around to the first grade teachers and I'm going to meet with all of them at least once, or just like touch base and have a conversation in passing with them, you know, at least once this month. And then the next month I would do second grade teachers and so on. And I would block it out that way. But what I would do is that I would just give them a copy of this and say, you know, even if this is just at the beginning of the year when you're mentioning that you have students who get speech services on, you know, that are in their class, I would give them this and just give them kind of again, just have a very quick 5-minute conversation with them at the beginning of the year, or, you know, at least once or twice throughout the year, and just say, hey, you know, remember when you're thinking about like how your students are doing, These are some things that I am looking for when I am considering whether or not a student might have some red flags for language issues. So what this does is it really just outlines that. And so this is just something that you can give as a handout to teachers so that they can understand what those red flags are, so that they just have a tool that they can use to understand, okay, when we're talking about a language disorder, what does that actually mean? Because a lot of teachers, like, they understand if a student is stuttering, or if a student isn't pronouncing sounds, they get that that is something that they should refer. Sometimes with articulation, they over-refer, which is fine. You just want to have those conversations about how eligibility works. I would always be happy to get more referrals than less referrals. I'd rather have teachers coming to me for help when maybe it's not a fit for the student, rather than them not thinking of me. But with language, a lot of times they under refer because they just don't necessarily see it as an issue, or they're not drawing that connection because it's not as straightforward. So it's really important to continuously have those conversations with the teachers that you work with. So, remember, like, I'm here if you have some students who are struggling to catch on to certain concepts. These are some of the things that I'm looking at. And you can even mention, if you've got a student who isn't following along in class, isn't following directions, maybe you're seeing some behaviors that aren't what you would want because they're not on task, because sometimes kids will act silly if they don't know what they're supposed to do, to just kind of, detract from the situation. Sometimes when there are those behaviors that come up that are distracting from the student's learning, there could be some learning issues behind that. So it's always important to continuously have those conversations. And this tool is a really good starting point to do that. So I recommend that if you have teachers and you want to educate them on what language, what red flags look like when it comes to making referrals for language, this is a really good document to give them. And, again, you can send it to all your teachers at the beginning of the year. If you've got teachers that will kind of shove it in a drawer, maybe make sure to go in and have an actual conversation with them and just give it to them physically and just kind of go through and say, hey, I just want you to, know that I'm here and I'm here to support you and your students. And these are some things that I can help with. Here's this document for your reference, and just give it every year. I had another red flags document I used to give that one of my professors created, but I've since reworked it and created this one just so that it's a little bit more in depth. So this is how I like to use this, and I find it very helpful in just giving me a starting point. So yeah, that's what we've got for today. I'm going to just reload my screen here to make sure that I didn't miss any comments. Okay, so those are all really the questions that I wanted to cover. And the reason that I addressed this is because I have had a handful of questions come in about eligibility. And again, I know that with language, it does get a little bit confusing because of the overlap in roles with teachers and things like that. I know with the articulation issue as well that I talked about before, I am always, I tended to, when I was in the schools, if I could justify helping a student, I would. If I could justify keeping them eligible, I would, in providing those services, especially when it comes to language. Because with language, unlike articulation, where it's like, okay, they can't pronounce the sound, but they're doing fine academically, they have friends, they're not upset by it, they're fine with how they talk. I mean, we don't necessarily need to address that, and they're welcome to go get private therapy if they want to. If a student was insisting that they work on it because they're self-conscious, that would be a different story, but that didn't happen that often. especially not at the junior high and elementary age. It might happen a little more in high school if students are a little more, self-conscious about it or aware. But with language, you can almost always justify an adverse impact. It is usually the extent to which. And a lot of times what eligibility comes down to with language is more of a logistics thing, just that SLPs don't necessarily have the bandwidth to cover students when they're in junior high or high school. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's just the way that the system works now. So with eligibility, with the whole, with the whole soapbox I got on at the beginning with private therapy is different from school therapy, I still agree with that, because you do need to have those clear boundaries, because a lot of times the way that the system works, you can't necessarily provide those services. But I do believe that if there is a way to do it, if there is a way to make students continually be eligible, using actual data, not just like finagling the data so that it looks nice, but if you are gathering non-standardized information like this, you're using academic data, you're looking at written language, and you're looking at some of those additional things, you can make a case to keep a student on your caseload longer. And even though some of the standardized tests tend to miss some of these language issues, you can make a case using other non-standardized methods. Now, how it might look and how it often ends up happening for older students is that you end up taking a role as more of a consultant because you can't provide those direct services. I don't think that that's necessarily the way that it should be, but I think that that's sometimes the way that it is right now. So I think that we need to keep continuing to educate people about what language disorders are and the impact that they can have, and continue to push that boundary so that we can provide more services for students for longer into secondary school, but at the same time acknowledging where we are and making the most of the current system where it is. And for you as the SLP, that's going to be really about building those relationships with those teachers, because a lot of times the student might need the services and you might be totally qualified and a fantastic person to provide those services. But if you can't provide that directly, what you can do is train other people. And actually, even if you did have more time with students and you could keep your students on your caseload longer, you should be doing that stuff anyways. You should be talking with teachers and getting them to reinforce what you're doing in therapy, and also talking with parents and families and students about language disorders and what they mean and how they can facilitate carryover outside of sessions. So having tools like this, just having, like, if you kind of feel overwhelmed with this, I would recommend that this be your first step, is just take this, print it out. Again, I'll share the link below. Take it, print it out, and make a point to use it as a conversation starter with people in your building. So even if you just do that one thing, that will get you down that road and help you to start having those conversations. Because I know that sometimes with these types of things, with education and training, it's a little bit intimidating. It's a little bit difficult to know where to start. So sometimes it does help to have this really simple, attainable, tangible step that you can take to start moving in that direction. And that can help you to start some of those conversations and build some of those relationships that helps move you forward. So that can be the one thing that you do right now. Print this out and make a point to share it with the teachers that you work with and perhaps your administrators. And then if you are having some confusion about the articulation norms, you can share those documents as well. So yeah, let me know your questions that come up over the month. I'm going to leave this thread in this group. I'm going to leave it pinned to the top. If you have any questions that come up about this topic or anything else, you're welcome to leave them below this video. You're also welcome to leave any questions in the members area below the videos in there. Other members can't necessarily see those notifications, but I can always see when you leave me a comment below a video in the members area. So if you leave me a question below a specific video in there, I'll be able to get back with a response for you as well. So thanks so much, everybody, for listening, and hope you have a great day. And again, let me know what questions you have that come up this month.